Well, that's why.
Welcome to our listeners and viewers, not only in Louisville, Kentucky, but around the globe, to the FORsooth Hour, where we provide time and space to individuals working on issues concerning social, economic, and environmental justice. For our first edition, Sam Avery joins us. Sam is a longtime activist and author working on issues involving environmental justice. He's also written extensively on a wide range of issues, including consciousness as it relates to physics, Buddhism, and most recently, the environmental justice movement and the climate catastrophe. His most recent book is The Pipeline and the Paradigm. The Pipeline and the Paradigm discusses the issue of the Keystone XL pipeline and the tar sands. Sam, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Sam, I hope to have a discussion regarding the Keystone XL pipeline, discuss mountaintop removal here in Kentucky and the Appalachian region in general, and segue into a discussion about your involvement with I Love Mountains Day. I'd like to start this conversation by discussing your latest book, The Pipeline and the Paradigm, as mentioned. The subtitle of the book is Keystone XL, Tar Sands, and Diffusing the Carbon Bomb. I thought we'd start by talking about all three of those components, but just a general conversation to start things off. I thought we'd discuss the Keystone pipeline system, the Keystone XL pipeline in general, and the tar sands. Can you start by talking about those things, and then we can talk about the more provocative part of the subtitle, which is the carbon bomb. So.
Well, the Keystone XL pipeline has become a symbol of the environmental movement as a whole. And the reason for this is that it taps into the second largest source of potential carbon fuel on the planet. The Canadian tar sands are next only to Saudi Arabia in terms of their total carbon content. So if we build this pipeline, which will tap into the Canadian tar sands and ship hundreds of thousands of barrels a day of tar sand down to a deep water port in Texas, if we undertake this project, we will be tapping into an enormous new source of carbon that could potentially get us up, within a few years, up close to a tipping point in which the climate could begin to become what we call a runaway situation, where we would get into some feedback loops in which the climate would get hotter and hotter on its own without our even adding new carbon to it. So the strategy of those who have begun to understand what's happening with the climate is to keep the climate from rising above 2 degrees centigrade. And if we tap into this brand new huge source of fossil fuel, we will reach that limit very quickly. So that's what I mean by the carbon bomb. We have already enormously changed the physical basis for life on this earth. Before we started burning fossil fuel, 150 years ago, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. Now it's getting up over 400 parts per million. That's not, a marginal increase. That's 41% more. Not 0.05 or 2%, 41% more. And you can't change the chemistry of a living system by that much without changing how it operates, how it works. So that's why we're seeing more intense weather systems. It's why 1/2 of the Arctic ice cap has already melted. It's why we're seeing hotter days and more droughts and more floods in various areas. And we're just starting to see that, because the effects of carbon in the atmosphere, new carbon coming into the atmosphere, takes about 20 to 30 years before we actually see the full impact of that. So the little bit of climate change that we've already seen is not a result of the 400 parts per million that's in the air now. It's a result of the carbon that our parents and grandparents emitted into the atmosphere a generation ago. So a generation from now, our children and grandchildren are going to be living with the effects of this enormous new surge of carbon dioxide that we're adding into the atmosphere. So it's something that it's I don't think we've reached a tipping point yet, but we're very close to that tipping point. And if we keep adding more and more new carbon into the atmosphere through such things as the Keystone XL pipeline, then we're going to reach that point very quickly.
And you've spoken with individuals on the ground in these areas. What are some of the implications for, say, the indigenous groups in those areas? And what has been their response to this?
Well, that's something that I found very interesting. And my approach to this whole problem is not so much to bring about a policy change, because I don't think the policy change is going to do enough. Mm-hmm. I think we have to have a fundamental change in who we think we are and what we're doing here on this planet in order to deal with something as serious and all-encompassing as climate change. This is the first truly global problem that humanity has reached. And when I talk to indigenous people in Alberta, people who are living up in the tar sands region, I've found, much to my surprise and my interest, that these people are very modern people. They dress in modern clothing, they have cell phones, they know computers, they're educated, and yet they still have a very strong belief in the living presence of the earth. It's something they're not shy about it. They take it for granted. Where those of us who are raised in urban settings, we may have come around to a realization that
Sure.
the earth is a living system.
But not as much part of our culture.
It's not part of our culture, and it's something that we kind of have to explain to ourselves. And it's not something that we can talk about to each other very easily because it's not part of the culture. Mm-hmm. But the people I met up there would always speak of Mother Earth and of the life of the earth and what we're doing to the life of the earth in a way in which this is something they grew up with. It's not a realization for them, it's something that's part of their life, part of their worldview. So it's that worldview, it's that understanding, that paradigm of the living presence of the earth that we have to begin to understand before we can actually begin to deal with a problem like climate change and a problem like the Canadian tar sands or the pipeline we're building to extract those tar sands. It's a much bigger problem than just going and taking a different policy stand.
In the pipeline, the Keystone XL is actually just one component of a very complex pipeline system. Is that correct?
That's true.
And this is corporate controlled, essentially, Trans-Canada, right? Mm-hmm. And this goes from Alberta, Canada to where exactly? What is
it? It goes down to Houston, Texas, and Port Arthur in Texas. And the reason for this, the whole purpose behind this pipeline is that the Canadian tar sands, as vast as they are, and it's a huge deposit, it takes up a big part of Alberta, Canada. It is landlocked. Just to the north is the Arctic Ocean, to the west is the Rocky Mountains, and to the east and south is the rest of the North American continent. So the problem that people are having who are promoting development of these tar sands is getting it out to a deep water port where it can be loaded on a supertanker. See? So that's the whole purpose of this pipeline. And other pipelines, there are about 4 or 5 of them currently proposed, that will be part of a new network that will be in place, if people have their way with this, it will be in place soon in order to maximize production and consumption of this enormous deposit, which will have absolutely untold effects upon not just humanity, but all living things on the earth.
And switching gears just slightly, do you think that the financial interests lead to individuals ignoring the science, which is looking them in the face? For example, the Republicans in the United States are nearly unanimously for the pipeline.
Right.
And the Obama administration wasn't necessarily a whole lot different until seemingly the pressure of environmental justice movements and climate justice movements applied the pressure to the Obama administration. Right now, if you look in the Washington Post and other mainstream media outlets, there's a lot of information about how there's not a decision made yet on this issue. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of pressure on Obama to make a decision. The GOP, again, is nearly unanimous on this. This gives rise to another question. How do you think the Obama administration has been on this issue, and then more broadly on environmental issues as a whole?
Well, Obama is I think one of the better presidents we've had, and I like him personally, but I do not look to the president or any other politician for an answer to this question, because they're not even asking the right questions yet. They're not asking any questions which are pertinent to the larger picture that we're all part of here. So I don't think that we're going to get any sort of new consciousness developed from this issue if we look to politicians to solve it for us. We're going to have to use the fact that it is the issue itself, the reality that it poses, and it's beginning to make us realize. That, I think, is potentially a positive thing, in that if this issue makes people realize the fragility of the climate and the fragility of the earth itself, then we will hopefully raise enough consciousness to, as I say in the book, to undertake a paradigm shift whereby instead of just making this a change in policy, we will make it a change in worldview, a change in understanding what we're doing and why. And if I could go into that in a little bit more detail, I think what I'm trying to say, and in the title of my book, it's the pipeline and the paradigm. The concept of the paradigm is very important. The paradigm is just a worldview. It's just a fancy word for worldview.
Sure.
But our society works under the assumption that the purpose in our human life on Earth is economic growth.
Sure.
Now, it's because it's an unconscious assumption, we don't talk about it that much. It's not something that people will stand up in church or at a committee meeting and say, that we believe that the purpose of human life is economic growth. They don't have to,
Sure.
because it's unquestioned, because it's an assumption. And so the problem here is that because it's assumed and we don't discuss it, then consumer demand becomes sort of like a hard reality around which we organize the rest of human society. It becomes something where we don't question the fact that consumer demand is the reason we do things. We're all supposed to line up and go out into the natural world and do whatever we can and whatever we have to do to meet consumer demand.
Well, as you were saying too, being someone who grew up in Western culture and urban culture, a lot of times Westerners, we do not see ourselves as part of nature.
Exactly.
We see ourselves as removed from nature.
Exactly. And see, the problem with the economic paradigm, and it has some good things about it, believe me, but the problem with the economic paradigm is it cannot see life. It cannot see non-human life. When it looks at a tree, it sees 2x4s. When it looks at a mountaintop, it sees a coal mine. When it looks at a river valley, it sees a sewer. So, in order to begin to deal with the real problem at hand with this tar sands in this pipeline is that we have to realize that we need to look beyond our worldview to the world itself. See, the world is much bigger than our worldview. So that's what a paradigm shift is. When you look at those old assumptions and you realize they no longer fit the picture that we're actually living in, we have to develop a new set of assumptions and a new worldview. And the new assumption would be that life itself is more important than economic growth. Okay, that sounds pretty simple, but it's huge.
Sure.
It's something that I found amongst the indigenous peoples in Alberta. And once you get to that point, you don't have to say this is, we're not against the economy. The ecology is not in opposition to the economy. It's just that we have to put the economy inside the ecology rather than trying to fit the ecology inside the economy. That's a huge difference.
Sure.
So that we still have to have jobs, we still have to have money, but our economic activity will now within the what I call the ecological paradigm, the shift to the larger paradigm, within that worldview, what we do for a living and what we do to support ourselves economically, we do in relation to the forests, in relation to the oceans, and in relation to the atmosphere, rather than trying to fit all of them into our needs.
Sure, sure. Well, you alluded to something interesting earlier. You said you don't see faith in any politicians, and you've compared the current environmental justice movement to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was very much bottom-up, grassroots, non-hierarchical, and while there were big legislative achievements, essentially this was a revolutionary movement that was trying to change the whole society. It wasn't just trying to stop at abolishing apartheid in the South. Mm-hmm. It wanted to completely revolutionize society. Could you speak on that comparison and maybe allude to some of the particular comparisons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, suppose we'd had a civil rights movement and all we got out of that was a Voting Rights Act or some sort of new civil rights legislation and so forth and so on. Then we would have just sort of gone on pretty much as we were before. But instead of that, the civil rights movement was a paradigm shift.
Sure.
It was a big change in who we think we are. See, before the civil rights movement, our primary identities were with our race and class background. And all of a sudden, with the civil rights movement, America became a bigger place, where African American people were part of the same thing that we are as white people. So that it had a much deeper effect than just changing how we are politically.
Sure.
It changed who we think we are spiritually, and that was a very big change. And it's a similar type of change that we need to undertake, maybe even a larger one, as far as our relation to the natural world is concerned. We have to see ourselves embedded in the natural world and as part of the living community, not just thinking of the natural world as being something that serves us and gives us the material basis for our economy. So a paradigm shift is less a change in what you do and more a change in who you are. It doesn't change what you're looking at, it changes where you're looking from. And that's a big difference.
Now let me ask you, the broad array of things that you write about are actually probably all interconnected. You write about consciousness and physics, and you've written about Buddhism. Mm-hmm. How has that informed your perspective relating to the environment or thinking about ecology on a broader scale?
Well, it is. It's hard to see what the connections are here, but actually, I've been talking here about conscious experience.
Sure.
And about being.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need here is a change in being. We need a change in our conscious perception of who we are and the world we're living in. So it really does get back to some of these questions of what is consciousness and what is the relation of consciousness to the material world, and what are the new ways in which we can experience consciousness. And so that's why I also have a deep interest in physics and the connection between the physical world and consciousness. And it all gets in there somewhere or another, though it's hard to see the connection.
It doesn't seem connected at first.
No, but it definitely is.
Sure. I wanted to talk to you about, I'm generalizing here, but largely we could say on the left, there's been two camps. And we've already talked about some of these issues, but there's generally been a more reformist camp amongst the left that says on an individual basis we must change our behavior, we must take public transit, grow our own food, drive hybrids, etc., make different consumer choices, or support pro-environment candidates. And you already said you don't necessarily have any faith in politicians, so I think I know where you would stand there, or lobby Congress or lobby the Senate, etc. And there's also there's another response on the left that has been more confrontational, that has seen this as not necessarily a violent war, but as a war to protect the planet, to participate in things like direct action, property destruction, nonviolent civil disobedience. So that's a more confrontational role. Do you see that as necessarily as a false dichotomy? Because arguably you've been someone who has focused on the education aspect, but you've also been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. Right. So what do you think about that? Is that you think that's a dichotomy or that's a false dichotomy?
I think that's a real dichotomy for sure. And I'm definitely on the revolutionary side of that. I would have to qualify that by saying that I definitely believe in changes in our consumer demands, in our consumer behavior. I still actively lobby the legislature on both the federal and the state level. And I certainly don't believe in any sort of use of violence.
Sure.
And I don't really think that the problem is so much with how our society exists now. It's more a problem of how we evolve from where we are. So what I mean by that is that I think it's a mistake to find other people who are to blame for the way the situation is. That's a very common human tendency.
Sure.
And most social movements, even political campaigns, revolutions, and so on, tend to concentrate on finding somebody you can focus on as being the problem.
Sure.
And this situation is different because, number one, it is a planetary situation. This is the first truly planetary crisis that humanity has dealt with. And what that means is that the rest of the living world doesn't care what race you are or what your political affiliation is, what nationality you are. The rest of the world has to adapt to how we act as a whole, how the human presence on the earth acts as a whole. So we have to learn to be a whole human presence and learn to act as a whole in relation to the rest of the living world, which means that we can't go around blaming each other for things. And there really are no specific people we can blame. Even the people who are building the pipeline, or the people who are blowing up mountains for coal, or the people who are gouging out the tar sands, or fracking the bedrock for natural gas. These people are not evil people. And in fact, they're doing what we want them to do at this point, because they're meeting the demand that we're creating by our continued use of fossil fuel. So they don't see themselves as evil people. We shouldn't see them as evil people. They are doing what our society is telling them to do. So we have to realize that it's the demand that we are creating that these people are reacting to. And that should not produce a guilt within us. And it tends to. Sometimes we tend to say, well, I drive my car. We've got electric lights on here.
Burning coal.
People who are watching this are probably living in a lighted room, probably a heated room, probably have something plugged into the wall so they can see this.
Sure.
So we all consume energy. And we should not feel guilty about that, because fossil fuel is wonderful stuff. I mean, it heats our houses, it provides artificial illumination, it actually feeds us in terms of artificial fertilizer, tractor fuel, refrigeration, computers, transportation. All these things are brought to us by fossil fuel. So we should realize the utility of this stuff.
Sure.
It's really good stuff. We should be thankful for it. The problem is not in seeing the utility.
Mm-hmm.
It's in seeing the permanence of fossil fuel. It's seeing this as going on and on into the future. This is just the stage we're going through. Fossil fuel is a short stage we're going through.
It's a dangerous stage.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but seeing at it as a stage is what's important. It gets back to the consciousness thing. Fossil fuel have only been around for 150, 200 years.
Industrial revolution, right? Yeah. You follow that? Yeah.
Not very long, and they're not going to be around much longer, no matter what we do.
Right.
The fossil fuels are not going to be around much longer.
Right.
So we have to see this as a transitional phase that we're going through. This is not the culmination of human society. This is just a stage we're going through.
Well, and then unfortunately for an economy like ours, which really says grow or die, short-term profit is maximized without concern for externalities. But these are extreme externalities when you're talking about a tipping point where not only human existence but all living existence could be changed forever.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
So we have to maybe start talking about the economy. Climatic change. A scholarly journal talked about how to play a little bit of devil's advocate to your argument that there is you had a blog post called "There Is No Enemy," articulating basically the idea that you just said. And I agree with you. I think if you think about oppressed and oppressors, it dehumanizes both, right? Oppression dehumanizes not only people at the bottom, but also the people at the top.
Yes.
But the system itself, we may not call these people evil, but if we think about the system itself, climatic change, this journal published a study that said two-thirds of all CO2 emissions are credible to the top 90 corporations on the planet. So do you think we need to radically change the system? Do we need to move on from this kind of economy, or?
Well, it's just, I think that we have to make major changes in our economy and our society. That seems inevitable to me.
Sure.
But as far as the climate and the environmental situation as a whole is concerned, if we concentrate on the social changes that result from and produce the situation we live in now, rather than the larger picture of ourselves in relation to nature, if we're just looking at ourselves and looking at how we interact, I mean, we have to do that, but if we concentrate on that, we're going to end up infighting. We're going to end up squabbling about what each of us means by justice. Justice is an imperative. In order to have a successful, organic society, you have to have justice, or people simply won't live in it.
Sure.
So it's not that we have to ignore this, but in order to make the shift to a new society, we have to be looking outside of ourselves and not concentrating on the purely human aspects of our interrelation. And so, in other words, I think that to emphasize the social aspects of the coming environmental revolution can be a trap. That what we need to do is broaden our awareness of the non-human part of the world that we live in.
The late activist and scholar Murray Bookchin often talked about what he called social ecology, and he attributed, his idea was that any kind of environmental destruction was directly related to social problems. And his idea was that, he was an anarchist, he was an anti-capitalist, and his idea was that essentially top-heavy institutions like the nation state or the capitalist economy were not, they could not exist with a harmonious relationship with human beings and the rest of the planet. Do you think that, for you, does that go too far, or is that?
No.
I know you've talked about an increased need for federalism and international federalism in your book, The Globalist Papers.
Right.
How could that kind of federalism, you think, lead to a more harmonious relationship with the environment?
Well, that's maybe a little bit better question, because if you look at every single major problem that humanity is faced with right now, whether it's the environment, the climate, international economics, population, world health, any major problem facing us as human beings is not a national problem, it's a global problem. So a lot of the despair we feel right now is that we don't even have the tools we need to work on these things. We can't, how are we going to deal with population when we're all divided up into separate nations, and the people who are feeling the pressure, feeling the need to limit populations are not the same nations as those who need to limit themselves.
Sure.
So that if you go to Africa, for instance, there's a lot of feeling that these outsiders are telling us what to do. And even in public health in Africa, a lot of the immunization programs are experiencing resistance because of their feeling that it isn't us, that that's not coming from us. So what I'm trying to say here is that to deal with how humanity is going to occupy this planet in the coming generations, and not too far into the future, will revolve around developing the tools, the institutions with which we can begin to solve some of these problems. And every one of those requires a global perspective. I mean, how can we deal with the climate as individual nations? I mean, China's going to deal with its climate, and we're going to deal with ours. Germany's going to deal with its atmosphere, and Africa's going to deal with its atmosphere.
Sure.
No way. And so all of these things require us developing an identity as people, which transcends nationality. So I would say yes, that much of the problem stems from the limitations of nationalism and capitalism. Because those are the things, that's what we have now, is nationalism and capitalism.
Arguably, it hasn't worked too well to solve social problems. Right.
But to say that just because those are the things we can look at and we have problems, that those are, that our problems are limited to those institutions. I don't think so. I think we have to transcend those institutions, but not necessarily by picking them apart and by blaming the institutions for our situation. We have to look past that.
And just curious, anarchism is something that I'm interested in. Do you see a model as replacing the contemporary nation state? Do you see something?
Yes, absolutely. Not anarchistic, no, I don't. I personally don't. But I think that I'm a great admirer of the federal Constitution of the United States. I think it's not as unique as we think it is as Americans.
Sure.
But it is very unique. And I think it can be applied on a higher level.
Well, there's even research pointing to that they were directly inspired by indigenous communities here when it came to councils and the ideas of democracy, which we often accredit to the West as this Western idea, which is a Western story, really. Yeah, that's a very interesting. If we could start to turn the focus now back to our region, Kentucky and Appalachia. Maybe we could talk about the current state of affairs regarding coal and mountaintop removal. And this might be a good time to talk about Louisville Loves Mountains Week, your involvement with the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. Why do you feel like these are important events, and what do you think the current state of affairs is, generally speaking, in Kentucky regarding coal burning, regarding mountaintop removal? Do you think we've made progress in those areas, or do you think that the status quo is kind of reigning supreme?
Both. I think we have made some progress, but it's amazing how powerful the coal lobby is in Kentucky. I have been going to Frankfurt for the last several years, lobbying for better legislation to just allow for the solar industry to compete on a level playing field with coal and even with natural gas, which is also a fossil fuel, by the way.
Sure.
And I've just been amazed at the extent to which people in Frankfurt, elected legislators, are absolutely terrified of solar energy. It's like communism. They feel like it's just going to, it's something that comes from somewhere outside of Kentucky, and we don't understand it, and it must be wrong. And even in the electric co-ops, in the rural electric co-ops, I've had a lot of experience with them because I've installed a lot of systems on the rural electrics, and a lot of people there are very progressive, but there's still a strong sense that this is a foreign thing, and we just don't do that here.
Sure. Could I stop you for a second?
Sure.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the electric co-ops and what that's all about?
Well, if you read the January issue of the Kentucky Living, which is put out by the Association of Kentucky Rural Electric Co-ops, there were three articles in there which blamed the new legislation coming out of Washington regarding the limiting of
CO2 emissions.
CO2 emissions. Three of those articles blamed that on the EPA. That the Environmental Protection Agency, which is coming out with new legislation, new regulations to limit the carbon emission from coal-fired power plants. The three of these articles made it sound as if the EPA came up with this war on coal.
Sure.
To punish people in Kentucky for some reason or other. I'm not sure why EPA would want to do this, but in other words, rather than trying to understand what's going on in the world, the people in the electric co-ops were instead trying to narrow it down to just how that affects the bottom line of electricity consumers. And if it costs a nickel more, then it's wrong, and the EPA, a bunch of faceless bureaucrats in Washington, are imposing this on us.
Probably in black helicopters.
Yes.
Yeah.
So at any rate, that's a big problem. It's not an insoluble problem, because I have found, I wrote an article, a letter in response to this, and was very favorably received by the editor of the magazine, and they're going to publish it. So, you know, it's not that that these people are, you know, too deeply ingrained in this.
Sure.
But, and going back to your question before that, it was my involvement with mountaintop removal that really got me was the initial reason why I got into the issue of the Keystone XL pipeline. Because I'm very passionate about mountaintop removal. It's local, it's right here.
Sure.
And you know, if you have any environmental consciousness at all, here's an issue which is deforestation, it's habitat destruction, it's water pollution, it's air pollution, it's climate change, and probably several other different issues, all wrapped into one. Right? Mountaintop removal is a systematic decreation of the biosphere. I mean, if you think how big the universe is, and the only very limited, very tiny little part of that universe is the biosphere, where things can actually live, where we have a physical basis for life. And mountaintop removal is destruction not only of the trees, but of the soil and the bedrock, everything that supports the life. And it's a dumping of the debris from mountaintop removal into the streams below and poisoning the streams. It's just an absolute 100% uncreation of that which has been given us in trust.
In a sense, it's also a story of the privatization of the commons, if you think about it,
Yeah.
because if you think about how much of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia is actually owned by, unfortunately, these coal companies. And it's rather disturbing if you see
Right.
the amount. And again, it comes down to mountaintop removal is a much more profitable and cheap way to extract resources, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, and it employs very few people. I think in the last 20, 40 years or so, I can't remember what the figure is, but it's like we now have something like 12% of the mining labor force that we had just a generation or two ago. It's because of mountaintop removal. It's a completely mechanized operation. So it does not provide new jobs. If anything, it destroys jobs. So it's an issue which gets me motivated to do something about the environmental situation that we're living in. And I went to a mountaintop the I Love Mountains Day in Frankfurt 2 years ago, and
Sure.
that's the beginning of my book on the pipeline.
Sure.
Because there was a woman, a Cree woman from Alberta, who spoke to our group there. She was from the tar sands region of Alberta. And I went up and talked to her afterward and ended up developing a contact with her, and that's how I ended up going up to Alberta and seeing their version of mountaintop removal, which doesn't happen in mountains, it happens in level forest land.
Sure.
The tar sands is just a very similar operation, just a total, utter, 100% destruction of the surface of the earth.
And there's a lot of exciting climate justice things happening in Canada, Idle No More, and
Yes.
similar to Mountain Justice or Kentuckians for the Commonwealth here,
Absolutely,
and,
right.
and are facing our own similar problems. Now, maybe we could just stop for a minute for the folks in Louisville, talk about briefly Louisville Loves Mountains Day, and talk about where you're going to be and what date that is
Yeah, that's
for the
gonna
listeners
be
and viewers.
at the Clifton Center on, I think, the 7th of February.
February 7th, yes.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And then maybe talk in brief about what I Love Mountains Day is all about in Frankfurt.
That's going to be on the 12th
Okay.
of February, and I'm not sure how many times we've been there, but it's been many years, and we go there every year. There's somewhere around 1,000 people. There've been sometimes as many as 2,000 people there. It's a big thing. It's a march and a rally, and it shows the legislators in Kentucky that we are serious about ending the practice of mountaintop removal. That's something that we can do here locally. Because,
Sure.
as I say, it's a part of so many other environmental issues, including climate change.
Absolutely. Probably close to 10% of the nation's coal comes from right here in Kentucky, right? If you think about the percentage of coal that comes here.
Huge.
I wanted to come back to something that we talked about briefly earlier, your criminal record, and talk about, if you're comfortable talking about it, we could talk about those experiences, and also talk about maybe if you feel that there is a necessity for us to move into a more confrontational role like that, where we not only put our freedom but our bodies on the line, and is that necessary?
It's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Because the way I understand the use of civil disobedience, and it can be used poorly as well, it has to be used well, and it should be used to develop awareness of a situation, and you have to find out the right situation. You have to get into the right situation. You have to develop the right symbols in order to express a larger picture. For instance, a segregated city bus is a symbol of a segregated society.
Sure.
See, everybody gets that.
Sure.
So if you protest against a segregated bus, people understand that you're protesting against the larger society.
Sure.
And you have to realize the difference between the symbol and the thing you're actually going for. For instance, in the lunch counter demonstrations in Greensboro,
Sit-ins. Yeah.
sit-ins there, they're very effective. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the newsreels of the old video footage of people just sitting there and taking all kinds of abuse and taking it well and not reacting violently. That was what was so powerful, because the purpose of civil disobedience is to get the witness, usually through media, to identify with the protester. And so here you have a situation where young black people are sitting in a counter waiting to be served, and then young white people behind them tormenting them, throwing things at them, verbally abusing them, sometimes physically abusing them, and they were just, the black people just stood there and took it. So the effect of this was to get people like me, I was just a young kid up in the north,
Sure.
looking at that saying, wow, and I identified with the people sitting at the counter. Not
Sure.
with the white people, I'm white, but
Sure.
I wasn't identifying with them. I was identifying with those young black people.
Sure.
Now if it had been a conflict, and they'd been fist fighting, and it'd been just some sort of fight there, then I would have just sort of dismissed, they're just squabbling it out there, and I would not have felt a strong pull toward either side. So that's the importance of nonviolence. A lot of people think of nonviolence as in negative terms, as just not being violent.
Sure.
But it's using nonviolence in a way that violence used to work. Because violence is very important, or has been a very effective way to change what people think.
Of course. Yeah.
So what we're trying to do is to use nonviolence in a way that'll change what people think. So using nonviolence in a way that violence used to be used. So it has to be used in a very sophisticated way. And I think you mentioned earlier how the Obama administration was kind of going along with this Keystone XL pipeline thing, and then 2 summers ago, a bunch of us went to Washington, and over 1,000 of us were arrested at the White House. So that raised the consciousness which created the issue of the Keystone XL pipeline.
Well, yeah, when NASA scientists are getting arrested,
Right.
James Hansen,
Right.
and yeah, that's high profile, and that says something to someone. You know?
That's right. So it's like, to get back to Greensboro, I don't know whether those guys ever got their lunch or not. Mm-hmm. But see, that was the symbol.
Sure.
So we have to get from the symbol to the larger picture, and they definitely got across the fact that if you or I were them, were sitting there with them, we would have experienced what they were experiencing. And so that's the importance of civil disobedience, is to get people who are going to see what we're doing to feel what we're feeling and see what we're seeing and kind of be there with us.
Sure.
And that's what will begin to change how people think and how they see the world. So we have to figure out ways to use this well.
Yeah, now I'm harking back to Zuccotti Park and to Occupy Wall Street. If you think about the conversations that we're having in America now, we're talking about capitalism negatively in mainstream media outlets, and talking about the 1%, and talking about income inequality. And a lot of people say that Occupy Wall Street was a quick blip on the radar and didn't produce anything. But if you think about that, civil disobedience too,
Yeah.
I really do think it did. So I think it changed the American psyche. It made us think about inequality. It made us think about striving towards a more ethical and equitable society. And I think that's the same way as what the climate justice movement is doing right now.
Right.
So.
Yeah, because I think Occupy Wall Street definitely changed the conversation, and that's the important thing. It's not when you involve yourself in public demonstrations and civil disobedience in particular, you're not really trying to change people's opinions.
Sure.
You're trying to change the questions, not the answers.
Sure.
You're trying to get people to look at something. It's like the Vietnam War, which I was also involved in demonstrating against that. And I don't think we necessarily changed anybody's opinions about the war, but we made them look at it.
Right.
And if we had not been there, that war might still be going on today and nobody would care.
That's right. And just to talk about that, if you think about the fact that before the Bush administration invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, there were massive anti-war protests.
Yes.
That did not happen during the Vietnam War. It became much later in the process.
Exactly.
And that anti-war movement in the 60s probably gave rise to the contemporary anti-war movement. And then if you think about Syria more recently. Now we have a president who went to Congress to say, are we going to do this, instead of unilaterally acting? And you see small gains of those acts of civil disobedience and those social movements.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit to alternative energy.
Okay.
I know that you're particularly interested in solar. Could you talk about your experience with solar for the individuals who are listening who may not know your involvement with solar panels? And
Yeah. Well, I put solar panels on my own house and then got into the business of installing it professionally. And it's something that I believe in deeply. And it's something that is also a good livelihood. You know, it's in demand, and knowing how to do it well is a very marketable skill. So it's definitely something that can be, it can be an economic activity that that pays off in financially as well as in other ways. And I think we're still at an early stage. You know, it's still pretty crude in many ways.
Sure.
In that the panels I'm installing right now are still only about 15% efficient. We could definitely go a long way on that. And there are much better ways. In time, I think we'll develop much better ways of taking advantage of this technology. My biggest problem I have when I go out to people's houses, at least half of the jobs that I end up looking at, I recommend against it because they have trees in the way, or their roof is not oriented properly, or there's chimneys or dormers or whatever obstructing the exposure. So in time, if we know that solar is a direction we want to go in, we'll start doing our landscaping and our architecture with solar in mind.
Sure.
So we'll start building buildings that you can just slap panels on, and I produce more energy than I use with my solar system. I mean, it's not that big a system, so it's definitely usable. I mean, it's very practical. And I've built a garage that I intend to put solar panels on, and I will be buying an electric car. I don't have one yet. I'm still waiting for the right one to come along, and I will be driving on sunlight very soon. And it's very, very, very efficient, incredibly efficient.
Sure.
Pennies a mile. The fuel itself, an electric car is 3 to 4 times as efficient as a gasoline engine. 3 to 4 times. And it's much easier to maintain. And we're going to be saving. Saving money is not the reason to go solar.
Sure. Sure.
But we're going to save a lot of money when we do.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so much more efficient. And so it's, you know, if we sit down and say, at this point, this gets back to the economic paradigm. If we say, I got to have this, and I got to have that, and I got to have this, and this all adds up to, you got to give me so much energy for my needs.
Sure.
Then we're never going to do it because it's too much. But if we start out and saying, okay, here's the earth, how can we live well within the carrying capacity of the earth? And there's so much sunlight, there's so much water, there's so much fertility. How can we adapt our needs to the reality, the larger reality that we live in? And we can do that easy.
Sure.
So we have to start out with the world and then find out what our needs are and how we can grow within that worldview. Rather than starting out with needs, what we think are our needs, and trying to build a world around that.
Sure.
It's backwards. And that sort of gets back to this whole concept of the paradigm that I'm talking about. So solar energy is not going to fit right into the economic demands that we're creating right now. A lot of people say, well, it doesn't produce enough energy. Well, what are you using it for? What are you doing with that energy?
Sure.
So it produces plenty of energy. It's just a question of how you're using it. What are you doing with that energy? And so we have to, if we can build a whole society around renewable energy, there's no problem with that.
Well, that alludes to my next question. There are these two scholars. They keep Mark Jacobson from Stanford and Mark DeLucci from University of California, Davis. They continue to produce calculations and papers that say the entire world can be powered by renewables. Mm-hmm. So they talk about a multifaceted approach: wind, solar, water energy, etc. If this is possible, and no, these are reputable. Scholars, this research keeps coming back. They're saying yes, this can be done. Mm-hmm. What are the barriers?
Right.
Maybe an obvious question, but one that should be discussed.
Yeah, the first barrier is psychological, spiritual, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. It gets down to what are we doing here and why are we here? If we're just here to see how much we can grow an economy and how much we can consume, then we're never going to make it with renewable energy. There's not enough of it. But if we turn that around and say, what can we do within the reality that is presented to us? We got plenty. There's plenty of water out there. There's plenty of fertility in the soil. There's plenty of sunshine. We have everything we need to live well, to live in prosperity. It's a question of learning how to use it well.
Sam, it's been a great pleasure talking to you today. And do you want to give us we need some plugs from you. So tell us where we can find your books. Tell us again, the event's going to be at the Clifton Center, February 7th, and that's Louisville Loves Mountains Day.
Right.
That's a component of the Kentucky for the Commonwealth's other event, which is I Love Mountains Day. That's
On
February 12th
right.
in Frankfurt.
Right.
So tell the listeners and viewers where they can find your books, your website.
Okay, yeah, I have a website. I even have a Facebook page that I don't pay any attention to. But the best thing, of course, is to get my book from a local bookstore. And Carmichael's here in Louisville has it. If you can't do that, you can get it online from Amazon or any other retailer. And I think it's something that I hope that you would enjoy reading. I have a lot of narrative in there of people I interviewed along the route of the pipeline, not just in Canada, but in the Dakotas and Nebraska and Oklahoma and Texas. And I was arrested again in Texas, opposing the southern leg of the pipeline, which is in operation now. So obviously we didn't stop it, but in a way the awareness we can develop around the pipeline is more important than whether this particular pipeline is built or not.
Well, Sam, thank you again for joining us, and that will conclude our interview. To the listeners and viewers, we will try to do this periodically, and we thank you for joining us.